I was just trying to get the Gotek to work on the Amiga 1000 here. It was just showing a white screen. It was not showing a Kickstart prompt. So I was looking online trying to figure out how do I get Kickstart to work on an Amiga 1000 with the Gotek. And there's posts, most of them are really old, earlier versions of Flash Floppy, earlier versions of the Gotek that didn't have the OLED screen but had just the three LED digit counters. And I finally found a post that got me partially there. It mentioned the Flash Floppy config file. And this didn't come with a memory stick, so it's like, oh, okay, well, I better learn about Flash Floppy since I know it's formatted with the Flash Floppy firmware. And that got me to the Flash Floppy GitHub page. And there are commands to make it start up with a disk image. So what I wanted to do was start it with Kickstart. And I thought that's why I had a white screen. Well, I still don't have that quite working. But I did figure out why I have a white screen and it wasn't working. And that is because this one, I think I mentioned in an earlier video, that I meant to buy one that was all set up for an Amiga, but when I clicked the buy now, it was from the same seller, but it wasn't already set up completely for an Amiga. So all I had to do, I did a bunch more research, and you're not going to probably be able to see, but these jumpers, there are labels behind them, and one of them is S0, and that's what the jumper near the top of this video. It was on it was on blank, so there's an S0 that it's on now. It was one up from that, which is S1, even though it, for whatever reason, isn't silk screened S1 right above the jumper. So I changed that to S0, and when I booted, I got a insert Kickstart disk screen. So that was like, okay, awesome. So it was confused because I have a disk select switch in here, and I think it didn't see a floppy drive at all. And so that's why it was just sitting on a white screen and not giving me an insert Kickstart disk prompt. So changed this to S0, and now I was able to select with the dial the Kickstart 1.3, and then it came up with Workbench, it came up with the Workbench prompt, and I selected the Amiga test kit, and it loaded the Amiga test kit. So I still have to figure out how to get it to automatically load Kickstart. I don't think it's going to be that big of an issue. I've got an FF folder. Inside of it, I've got an FF config that right now just says, and I've been messing with this for a while, and I can't remember what the exact setting is, but there's a setting for start with an image. And then you need to make another config file, just a text file that ends with, file that ends with CFG instead of TXT, and tell it what file you want it to load. So every time it powers up, you can have it load a static, and I wanted it to load Kickstart. And so that's not working. So there's another setting for eject when you boot it up. So I'm wondering if I have to have that in combination with the start image being Kickstart, so that when you turn it on, it doesn't eject and then it loads Kickstart. Because when I was trying it, it would just show Xcopy here. It wasn't even showing Kickstart. So that was telling me it's just using the startup image command. Either I've got it spelled wrong, or I have to tell it that the Kickstart is in the root folder where my config files are in an FF folder. There's somehow where the startup is not finding the Kickstart image to load it every time this the Gotek powers on. So I don't think that's going to be a huge issue. One thing to note that I found while looking at this stuff that people might not know is if you use a config file like I have on this USB stick now that says make the Kickstart what it boots to whenever it's powered on, every time you power on the Gotek, it looks for the config file. If there's a config file, it flashes that config file to an EEPROM. So every single time I start this, it will set the EEPROM. It'll save that setting. And you only need to do it once. So once it works, you should probably remove your config file because I don't know if the EEPROM in the Gotek has limited write cycles, and I don't know if it maybe slows things down because it has to save that config file to the Gotek EEPROM before it continues with the actual instruction and does what you're telling it to in the config file. So that's something that I haven't really seen mentioned in videos. I figured out how to get Kickstart to load when I power up the Amiga 1000. It's really easy, but I didn't know where to look because normally when I do things like this Gotek, for example, I'll build the thing myself. I'll flash the firmware myself, but I decided to buy one online that had already been flashed to Flash Floppy firmware. And that meant that I never looked at the GitHub page for the Flash Floppy firmware and didn't know there were a bunch of config files that you can make changes to how Flash Floppy behaves. So once I found a post of somebody how they got their Amiga 1000 to boot the Kickstart, I knew it was just a matter of commands, and then I had to find the commands. Now the commands that were in the article I read were old, and Flash Floppy had changed. So one of the file names was not correct, so it didn't work when I first tried it because the Flash Floppy version that is on this Gotek drive is newer than the one from the blog online that I found that pointed me towards the Flash Floppy GitHub. So I figured it out. What I've got here, this is a backup copy of my thumb drive. And I've made a demo directory, a games directory, a utilities directory. I've got my Kickstart 1.3 disk image, a twin kick disk image, and a workbench 1.3 image. Now I have an FF directory, and that's the key. If you make an FF directory when using the current version of, well, as of December of 2025, if you make an FF directory for Flash Floppy on your USB stick, you can put some things in there. Most importantly, FF.config. The FF.config file can contain all sorts of information, which is on the Flash Floppy GitHub page. So, drive emulation, all kinds of things that you can change on your Flash Floppy installation. So these are all settings that I'm assuming you can make when you first flash the firmware onto your Gotek. But they're also things that you can change on the fly. So what I've done is, per the GitHub page, I have a FF directory. Inside of it, I have a file called FF.config. And anything you put in here will be flashed to the EEPROM of the Gotek whenever you power up your drive. Now, When I first did this, it wasn't working, and it was a stupid typo. It took me a while to realize that instead of an equal sign right here, I had a dash. So image dash on dash startup space equals space static is telling the Gotek you're going to boot from a constant file, a static file. Every time you boot, use the same file. And that's all I've got in there. I could have other commands if I wanted to have the drive behave differently. I could add other commands, and whenever it powers up and it sees this file, it will execute those commands and flash them to the EEPROM. Even if, I believe, even if they're already on the EEPROM, I think it might still flash the EEPROM. So, FF.CFG says load from one disk image every time you power it on. How does it know what disk image? init_a.cfg. And in my case, I put Kickstart 13.adf. So if I go up to the root directory, I've got Kickstart 13.adf in the root directory. So you don't even have to declare a path. Just make a FF directory, an FF.CFG file that says, I want to use the same startup disk image every time this unit powers on. And then create init_a.config. And these are just text files. Just make a text file and then rename txt file extension with CFG. And tell it Kickstart 13 or whatever you want it to use for a Kickstart disk. Now, because it writes that to an EEPROM, you only have to do that once. You get it to work once, and you can actually delete that FF.CFG file from your thumb drive because you no longer need it to update the EEPROM. The config file is basically saying, okay, I know the firmware that was flashed to this drive behaves a certain way. I want to change this parameter. So I've tested this on my USB stick. I no longer have FF.CFG. I still do have the init_a config, and it works. What I'm thinking of doing is put the FF.CFG back on my thumb drive, but add a comment. In fact, I'd have to look at the I'd have to look here to see what character they use to make comments in the config file. There are some examples in here. I can't remember if it's the $, what a hashtag, whatever you want to call that. So that I can make a comment saying, uncomment this line if you want to cause the Gotek to boot up to a different disk image on power up. And then leave this in here. So there'll still be an FF.CFG, but it'll actually have a comment saying, hey, if you want to change this, just change this line. So if I want to instead boot to TwinKick, I could just go into FF.CFG and change, uncomment the line that says image on startup. So it's no longer commented, and then change init_a config to TwinKick, power on the Gotek, and just powering it on once sets that up in the EEPROM. So then you can go back into FF.CFG and comment that out if you don't want it to flash the EEPROM every time you power it up. So proof is in the pudding. I have the case on the Amiga now, obviously. I have my second floppy drive, which right now is not plugged into the Amiga. I do have the Gotek plugged in to the external port in the back. I have my DF0 switch set so that this is DF0. I haven't tried. I'm not sure what it'll do. So I thought maybe I'd ask somebody before I did it, but this has a pass-through. So if I connect the external A1010 drive to the back of the Amiga, and then I connect the Gotek to the back of the A1010 external, and I have my switch flip to make this DF0, does that still work? Will this be DF1 and this be DF0? Will this be DF0 and I won't see either drive? I'm not sure how that works, so I haven't messed with it yet. Same thing, if I flip the DF0 drive switch in the other direction, does this give me DF0, DF1, and DF2? Not quite sure. But if you watch the OLED screen here when I turn this on, you'll see that it's going to boot Kickstart 1.3 disk image. I didn't see it because I'm looking through the camera, but I think it might show the last image that it actually was loaded first, because it keeps track of that in its own config file that it writes to the USB stick. So I think it'll show the last thing I loaded, and then it goes right to Kickstart, and it boots from Kickstart. So there we go. Turn the power on, it automatically boots the Kickstart image, and I'm at the workbench prompt.